Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. First hour, we're going to spend some time talking about immigration, and it might be good before we get into the topic to even think about why we are talking about it. It's in the news, but not for the typical reasons. Oftentimes when we've talked about immigration here on Point of View, it's because we have a piece of legislation that has been proposed in Congress, or because there was some statement by the president about a change in policy, or maybe a gang of 8 have decided to push through some legislation. But that's not why we're talking about it. I think there are at least 3 good reasons. The first is Ann Coulter had a book that came out a while back called Adios America, and she's been writing a series of columns beginning to document some of the things she found in her investigation on immigration. Then, even more significantly, was the speech given by presidential candidate Donald Trump at his presidential kickoff speech. And if that were not enough to maybe even get the conversation going, of course, we have this tragic death of Katie Steinle, who was killed last week, July 1st, in a shooting at San Francisco on the pier in what is a sanctuary city. And we're going to talk more about what that means in just a minute. There have been, of course, a lot of people that have said, well, I can just blush some of this off because, after all, some of these individuals that I mentioned, like Donald Trump and Coulter, they're just kind of firebrands. But the topic has sort of moved away from them into some of those facts and figures and statistics that we'll be talking about here today. One aspect of the debate that is really taking place right now has to do with whether or not we should have sanctuary cities. There are about 200, according to the Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement Officer, Sarah Saldana. So there are quite a few. Some of you that are listening to this broadcast may be living in a sanctuary city or certainly nearby and know what they are. Some of you might say, I've heard the term, but I really don't know what it means. So let's, if we can, start with the obvious. And that is a sanctuary city, which is a phrase, by the way, that's not always liked by the supporters of it, is a city or a county or whatever that actually have policies or laws that limit the extent to which law enforcement and other government employees will go to assist the federal government on immigration matters. And so in San Francisco, to use a good example, in 1989, they passed what was called the City and County of Refuge Origin, an ordinance, and it would actually prohibit city employees from helping federal immigration enforcement efforts unless compelled by court order or state law. Now, this movement has really grown out of efforts by churches in the 1980s to provide what was called sanctuary in Central America. And those, quote, sanctuary cities were there in large part to really help individuals who were fleeing the violence at their home, and the decision that some of the churches provided that they would not turn those individuals over to the authorities where they would probably be killed. This is a little bit different, but that's where kind of the movement came from. And since we obviously talk about churches so often here on Point of View, I thought I might mention that we don't just have sanctuary cities and sanctuary counties, but we also have sanctuary churches. And a piece that came out just today by Michelle Malkin documents that in some detail. In Northeast Portland, Oregon, you have a Lutheran church there that is shielding an illegal alien after he committed drunk driving and drug crimes and violated deportation rules. You have in Tucson, Arizona, a particular individual who has sought refuge in Southside Presbyterian Church and then later in First Christian Church in order to avoid deportation. In Austin, Texas, the First Unitarian Universalist Church is harboring an illegal alien because they want to deport her. In Denver, you have another individual that has actually taken up residence in the First Unitarian Church of Denver, Colorado. And just one more to illustrate the point. In Chicago, you have another illegal alien who is at the United Methodist Church there, and that is somebody who has been kind of a serial lawbreaker and actually has been harbored by the church. So this is not just a phenomenon in some of these cities. Interestingly enough, it is a phenomenon that has grown up originally from some of the churches, and now we find it in some of the cities and in the counties as well. The argument for a sanctuary city is that it makes this particular group of individuals, those people who are here illegal, safer, and also builds trust. I think it is interesting to recognize that we've had quotes from all sorts of individuals over the years, even Hillary Clinton, and we'll see whether or not she pulls back on that as well, as to this being very safe. When she spoke at Dartmouth College a number of years ago, she said that sanctuary cities help to ensure the, quote, personal safety and security of all citizens. And, of course, we have the sheriff in San Francisco who actually made the comment that we're a world-renowned city with a large immigration population. Went on to say, from a law enforcement perspective, we want to build trust with that population. I guess we could ask the question how much trust we had with the individual that pulled the trigger that killed this 31-year-old. But nevertheless, this is the phenomenon that is on the news right now. And I think because of sort of the juxtaposition or the nexus of all these different things, books being written on immigration, speeches being given by people like Donald Trump, and then having all sorts of people reacting to it, both political candidates as well as commentators, and then this shooting in San Francisco, which, as I'm going to point out a little bit later in the program, is just one of many. But for some reason, this one has really captured the nation's attention. You are starting to see a lot of people begin to back down on this idea of sanctuary cities. I could give you a lot of quotes, but probably the best one to use today would simply be from the former mayor of San Francisco, who is the senior senator, U.S. senator from California. And when Dianne Feinstein, who was a mayor of San Francisco, who is also very progressive, perhaps one of the more progressive members of the United States Senate, saying that maybe it's time to reconsider these sanctuary city policies, I think you can begin to see that there has been a remarkable change in some of the mindset that is actually taking place. So when we take a break, we're going to come back, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time just putting a few of those facts and figures that have surfaced in all sorts of discussion. Some of those come from Ann Coulter's book. We've not had her on because, again, sometimes she can be inflammatory, but some of the facts and figures are pretty amazing. We have some that come from various immigration authorities, some that come from the government, some that have been cited by individuals either agreeing with or disagreeing with Donald Trump. And immigration is really the issue of the day, and it's one that I think we need to discuss. And, of course, as always, we will open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation today. What happened in San Francisco a week ago is certainly caught a lot of people's attention, and you can find that we've posted a couple of articles, one on the outrage over the immigration rules, another one on the human cost of the immigration policy, and you'll see some of the facts and figures which you might want to share with other people that you know as you're involved in either a face-to-face discussion or maybe some kind of discussion on Facebook or Twitter or somewhere else. So let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the facts and figures that have surfaced over the last couple of weeks here on this issue of immigration and see how that might affect future immigration policy. All that coming up right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The death penalty is dying a slow death. Last month, Nebraska became the 19th state in the country to end the practice of capital punishment. The legislature voted to abolish the death penalty and was able to override the veto of the governor. Columnist George Will reminds us that Nebraska is not a nest of liberals. When a conservative state like Nebraska abolishes the death penalty, we should take note. For many years, liberals and progressives have opposed the death penalty because they believe the state should not have the power to execute people, and also rightly point to the number of mistakes that have been made by the courts. Conservatives also point to those mistakes, and they argue that governments are fallible and the death penalty is a government program. The theological basis for capital punishment can be found in the Bible. Genesis 9:6 makes the case by explaining, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Justice and moral proportionality are the principles behind the concept of lex talionis, a life for a life. And though we are no longer under the legal code in the Old Testament theocracy, we can see many crimes listed in the Old Testament that demanded the death penalty. In the New Testament, we see the principle of capital punishment being reinforced by Romans 13:1-7. God ordains government, and the civil magistrate is a minister of God. Paul uses the image of the sword, which also supports the idea of capital punishment. There have been mistakes in the way capital punishment has been administered, but that's not an argument against the death penalty as much as it is an indictment of the criminal justice system. It's also an argument for the careful implementation of the death penalty. When we have clear evidence of a premeditated murder, think of the actions of the Boston Marathon terrorists, then government should be free to move ahead. However, more and more liberals and conservatives have decided to abolish the death penalty in their state. We'll probably see fewer and fewer executions in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Immigration, our topic today, and in particular focusing on the sanctuary cities. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Again, you always have to issue the obvious disclaimers. We recognize a lot of people that come to this country want to simply pursue the American dream. Whether they came here legally or illegally, they certainly want to enjoy the benefits of living in this country. And we are blessed to live in this country, and we understand that. But what I want to focus some time and attention on is what happens when we have individuals who have pretty much demonstrated that they will not make good citizens, whether they came here legally or illegally. What do we do with them? The individual, and you will notice that I never talk about the perpetrators, but the individual that actually shot Katie Steinle was deported 5 times and had 7 prior felony convictions. Okay, 5 times he was deported because he was here illegally. He had 7 prior felony convictions. Isn't that enough to incarcerate him or make sure he does not come back to this country? He did interviews, interestingly enough. You've got to ask a question. You just killed somebody. You're in prison, and you get to do interviews. It's kind of like, okay, I'll get my PR people to talk to your PR people. We'll set up an interview. We'll do media here. But anyway, it's just bizarre that we allow those kinds of things to happen in a prison, or in a jail cell. But nevertheless, he made it pretty clear that he came here for one reason, and that is he knew this was a sanctuary city. He didn't use the word, but he knew that this is a place where he would not be deported. And so even though there is not an attempt by the mayor and the various supervisors to necessarily attract individuals by letting it be known that it is, quote, a sanctuary city, it's a good, safe place for an individual who is been able to sneak back in the country 4 times. Now this was the 5th time, and able to make his way to San Francisco and commit this crime. Let's get a few of the facts on the table here, and then I'm going to open up for some of the comments that you might have. The first is that it has been really surprising in this debate over the last couple of weeks. First with Ann Coulter's book, and then with the back and forth over what Donald Trump had to say, to find out that, for example, even though most Americans have a high school diploma, about 93%, about 75% of illegal aliens do not have a high school diploma. Of course, Donald Trump was criticized for saying that they're not sending our best. Well, whether they're sending in, they're sneaking across the border. I think you could have to be honestly saying that if an individual does not even have a high school diploma, does not have an ability to speak English, that really those that are coming from Mexico right now are not achievers, at least in the educational or economic sense. But I want to focus most of my time and attention on how many of those people that are here illegally are in prison. And this is where you immediately run into a roadblock, because the federal government really refuses to tell us how many prisoners are immigrants. And what we do know, though, is pretty concerning. So let me give you a few of the facts that you can discern. Let's take one. Ann Coulter lives in the New York area, so obviously she used this one. There are more foreign inmates in the New York State prisons from Mexico than from the entire continent of Europe. Put another way, you've got to recognize that about half of all Mexican immigrants in the United States either live in Texas or California. New York is not a place where you find a lot of individuals from Mexico in terms of the vast percentages that are found both in Texas and in California. So that gives you a little bit of an inkling. This one is a little more substantial. That is, 71% of non-American citizens in federal prisons are from Mexico. One government statistic said that Mexican criminals represent 16% of all the convicts serving federal time in federal penitentiaries. And so we already have a little bit of an idea of what that is taking place. Pat Buchanan has weighed in on this. He wrote a book years ago called State of Emergency, and one of the research pieces he pulled out was that 2/3 of the 17,000 outstanding fugitive felony warrants in Los Angeles were for illegal immigrants, as were 95% of the 1,500 outstanding warrants for homicide. So again, we are starting to see something that would suggest that this is a problem that the federal government does not want to talk about. And yet, again, what we had happening in San Francisco this time last week is just perhaps more of the tip of the iceberg. Let's look at another one. If you look at the crimes committed by illegal aliens released from federal custody, this would be homicide, sexual assault, theft, kidnapping, and alcohol-related driving convictions. In all, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE, freed about 36,000 aliens, illegal aliens, and those 36,000 were convicted of 88,000 crimes. In other words, in round numbers, almost 3 for every one that was released from these detention centers. And again, that one can be verified simply because we have some of the ICE statistics. Another way is to look at some of the records for the breakdown of freed illegal aliens. The records show that 16,000 were convicted of driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Over 9,000 had dangerous drug convictions. Over 1,000 were convicted of aggravated assault. 426 of sexual assault, 193 of homicide, and additionally, the records show that about 1,100, almost 1,200 of the freed illegal immigrants had stolen vehicles and had stolen vehicle convictions. 300 so plus were convicted of kidnapping, and over 300 flight escape convictions there as well. So you can begin to recognize that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And there are a variety of ways to address it. One is to stop these sanctuary cities and communities. Another is to actually enforce some of these laws. Let's remind ourselves that back in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform Act, and the goal then was to grant a one-time amnesty and secure the border. We did not. And so as a result, you then had a few years later another piece of legislation, actually 10 years later, which was signed by President Bill Clinton. And this was another immigration reform bill in 1996. And so as a result, you had a further requirement of deporting these individuals and to tighten down some of the regulations. And that over time has been loosened time and time again. One by, for example, the mayor and the councils and the supervisors and others in places like San Francisco, and also by the Obama administration in 2010 said they were not going to even abide by some of the things that were actually in that 1996 law. And so we have the laws on the books. The real question is whether we have the will to do so. And lest you think that what happened in San Francisco is an isolated case, let me just before we take a break use one more example. And this is the story of a man who confessed to murdering his wife with a hammer in Laredo, Texas. He had been deported 4 times. He had been in the United States and had not been able to illegally cross back into the border multiple times from Mexico after his deportation. In addition, the Laredo Police Department continuously encountered the man in violent episodes with his wife, yet they did not notify Border Patrol, according to federal agents who actually spoke on the condition of anonymity. So we have a problem, and the problem needs to be addressed by legislation, but also by a will on the part of an administration and other elected officials. We can see this is not just a federal issue, it's also a state and local official problem as well that needs to be addressed. And when we come back, I'll have a couple more facts and figures to put on the table, but also want to open up the phones to get your comments. Is it time to end these sanctuary cities? Is it time to come up with a firm plan for immigration reform to secure the border and to make sure that individuals who have made it very clear by their behavior that they are not going to make good citizens, to deport them and to keep them out of this country? The question is on the table, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Immigration in the news today, and if you'd like to join us, we would love to hear from you. Just before we take a break, let me mention that yesterday we did one last mention of the fact that we are encouraging you, if you would like to do so, to support our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who are in refugee camps and have been displaced by ISIS. If you wanted to support them, and we had a very good response yesterday, I might mention. We've already sent a check to the Cradle Fund for $30,000, and we're getting close now to $40,000, so we will be sending another check. So if you have not had a chance to maybe act on that and do what you can to support those individuals, fellow believers in Christ who have suffered so much at the hands of ISIS, we encourage you one last time to go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that button, and we are excited about the fact that we're going to send another significant check very quickly to those individuals, and that will be then administered by the churches to those Christians, and the hope is to eventually not only to rescue and restore them, but to return them back to their homeland. We'll see how that plays out. But if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to support that Cradle Fund, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Just over a month ago, we asked you to dig deep and help us send money to the Cradle Fund, emergency help for Christians forced to flee by ISIS, driven from the lands their forefathers have inhabited, sometimes for 2,000 years and more. We asked, you responded. Together, we sent $35,000 to provide things like emergency food, shelter, and relief. And hear this, the money is handed out through local Christians. The people being helped know exactly who is assisting them. It's the body of Christ, people like you, in the name of Jesus Christ. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. I was running from ISIS, and you helped me." On behalf of the Cradle Fund and the entire family of Point of View, thank you. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212, talking about the broad issue of immigration, but focusing especially on some of the very important control issues, and one of those has to do with the sanctuary city. And if you are just joining us again, we're talking about this murder that took place last week in San Francisco of the individual who killed Katie Steinle, a beautiful girl, 31 years of age, walking on the pier there in San Francisco. We've all walked there before if we've been in that town. 5-time deported illegal with 7 prior felony convictions. Why was he there? Well, he was there in large part because he knew it was a sanctuary city, and he knew that he probably wouldn't be deported, even though he had been deported 5 times before, and he felt a little bit safer there. And as an individual that had prior felony convictions, why was he in this country? Why didn't we put him in jail? All sorts of questions can be asked, but we certainly want to give you a chance to join the conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head to Illinois first. WPEO there in Peoria. Gene, thank you for calling today.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask you, I see a lot of people in my area, and I don't know if they're here, if they're citizens, but a lot of them, the Mexican people, are here, and they work at fast food and different places. Do they have to get a special card, or can they work here without being a citizen, or how's that work?
Well, and it depends. Since you've used the fast food illustration as an example, theoretically, the employer had to check on their Social Security card and the rest, so you would hope that they were here either in the process of becoming legalized citizens or were here already as legal citizens. But I also recognize there's a great deal of fraud that takes place where sometimes they show a false card or a false Social Security card, and thus they're here illegally. But many times, if they're in that particular line of work, they're probably here in some kind of legal status. By contrast, if they're working for some contractor or something like that, maybe not. So the quick answer is I don't know. The best guess is that if they're in a fast food restaurant or in a some kind of business where they are required to check using whether they use E-Verify or something like that, then you would hope that they would be legal. So that's about all I can really tell you, and it would be worth asking somebody next time you're in one of those establishments if indeed they'd use any kind of background checks on the individuals that are working there.
Okay, well, that's what I wanted to find out.
Appreciate you raising that question, and it will be one that we'll maybe get to a little bit later as well. But let me take another phone call or two first. We'll go to South Carolina. And Chris, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Good afternoon. How you doing today, sir?
I'm good. I appreciate you calling.
Good. I wish we could do another miracle like Lazarus and resurrect Ronald Reagan. Well, the question I have, and I think I know the answer, which party is going to do, or administration is going to do the most about this? Pretty sure I know the answer.
Well,
and take it a little further, which candidate would be the best one to do something about this? Because the numbers I heard just traveling that interstate were staggering. I knew it was a problem, but I didn't know it was that big of a problem.
And I haven't even put all of them on the table because I just figure you're probably getting worn out with those numbers. It's hard to kind of keep track of numbers when you're listening to radio. But again, that's why we have some of that posted on our website, because it is much more of a problem than you would know. And that brings me to a couple points. So, Chris, let me kind of add that. First of all, are there individuals that have supported sanctuary cities? Yes, and they almost exclusively are in the Democratic Party. You mentioned one candidate. Hillary Clinton has gone on record. Now, she may change her mind after what's transpired over the last 48 hours, but just like Dianne Feinstein. But she has gone on record saying that she thinks sanctuary cities are a good thing. And I even gave you that quote because she actually was convinced that this kept people out of the shadows and gave you an opportunity, as even the sheriff there in San Francisco said, this is a way we could actually create a level of trust. Well, that was his line. That's not my line. He really believed that this is one of the ways that we can really establish some kind of trust with those individuals. It hasn't worked out so well, but again, Sheriff Murakami, I think is how you say his name. We're a world-renowned city with a large immigrant population. From a law enforcement perspective, we want to build trust with that population. And of course, I gave you the quote from Hillary Clinton when she spoke at Dartmouth. So we can see that that hasn't been something that has been really a front burner issue for the Democratic Party. And that requires us, I think, to go back a little further to 1965. Ted Kennedy was the one that sponsored the 1965 Immigration Act, and it changed the nature of how we let people into this country. It allowed people to come from poor countries and really, in a sense, was designed in part to help the Democratic Party. As a matter of fact, as Ann Coulter points out in her book, it worked. The post-1970 immigrants vote 8-2 for Democrats. And as a matter of fact, citing this dramatic shift in the Democratic Party's fortunes, Patrick Reddy called the 1965 Immigration Act, quote, the Kennedy family's greatest gift to the Democratic Party, unquote. And so you can see that in some respects, it's changed the nature of America. And if you want to have one more fact or figure that will help you out, America essentially has taken in 1/4 of Mexico's entire population. And if you see how that has changed the demographics of many of these states, you can begin to see why the Democratic Party is usually much less inclined to bring about welfare or immigration reform or those kinds of things, because indeed this provides a possible constituency and a rather dependable vote for the Democratic Party. Okay, so you run over to the Republican side. What about that? Well, I think we already see that one individual that has really started this debate is Donald Trump. Now, whether he would make a good president or not, I'll leave that to your conversations with us in the next couple of minutes. But you can see that even as people have reacted to him, that gives you a little better idea. You see people like Ted Cruz saying, I wouldn't have said it that way, but I agree that he's raising a very important issue. Basically, you have a few others. Rick Perry saying, yeah, I wouldn't have said it that way, but, you know, we really do have a problem at the border. And so you have some who actually do seem to believe that immigration and border control are appropriate. But you have others that have benefited as well, not just in the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party. I mean, a lot of businesses enjoy the fact that if you have someone here illegally, they can pay them a lot less. Matter of fact, they don't have to necessarily report all that income. And so you have, I think, a real challenge in this next campaign cycle to really ask good questions about candidates, both for the presidency and for Congress, and even now for your state legislature and your city council, because some of these problems have to do with federal regulations. Some have to do with laws that need to be passed by Congress. Others have to do with whether or not that city will be a sanctuary city. And so I think it's going to be really important for individuals to take the time to evaluate where candidates stand on some of those topics. Let's take one more phone call before we take a break, and I'll get into a couple of other issues. We'll head out to Georgia this time. And Jeff, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that Trump, he was exactly 100% politically correct on everything he said about the immigration, and I didn't say nothing wrong with it. And I mean, it's you can look on the news, and it's you know, how can you, when right's right, wrong's wrong, you know, it'll be that way to the end of the world. And plus what he said about jobs going to Mexico and China, that's why we don't have no jobs, and he was 100% correct on that too. And I was a painter most of my life, and I know that for a fact because my job, I'd hardly starved to death for years because of immigrants and stuff doing my job cheaper than I could do it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to obviously pay them maybe a basic wage, or maybe you don't have to report the income. Obviously, that's the case. You know, one of the other things that Donald Trump was criticized for is he also talked about rape. But again, you look at some of these numbers, and this comes from the Border Patrol themselves, and this is there have been 40 cases of sexual abuse by illegal aliens this year, reported by the Border Patrol in terms of one of their reports. This one comes from Tucson, Arizona. 3 of the 12 individuals who were convicted there were violent gang members, 2 of whom were previously deported. Then they talk about another 13 gang group that they went after, and 5 of them were all convicted sex offenders for sexual crimes against minors. The rest had extensive criminal records that include convictions for sexual abuse, battery with serious injury, domestic violence, and child abuse. So, again, even the part that was seen as most controversial, we can see by just looking at some of the records that have been made available by the Border Patrol or by ICE or by the Center for Immigration Studies or by Ann Coulter or by a variety of others that have been interacting with some of the things that Donald Trump has said. You can see that we've got a problem, and the sad reality is oftentimes the mainstream media does not cover that. And when we come back from the break, I think we have a new insight as to why we aren't reading about this as much in some of the newspapers as we might think we should. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, I want to do two things. First of all, talk about why we don't always hear about these issues of immigration. And then second of all, maybe talk a little bit about how to think about this biblically. You know, one of the lessons I learned from Marlon Maddox, who was the founder of Point of View, and he used to use this phrase often, and we don't use it around here enough: follow the money. Follow the money. And I think you can begin to understand why some of the mainstream press does not cover this issue of immigration. First of all, I think a lot of those individuals that are in the media tend to be open border kind of individuals anyway. So they already have a predisposition to say, you know, we're enjoying the fruits of the American economy. Why can't everyone else? Well, a country that does not have any borders is not a country, but we can leave that conversation to another day. But follow the money was something I learned by reading parts of Ann Coulter's book, because she points out something that I'd never really paid attention to. And back in 2008, the world's richest man, by the way, you know who that is? Carlos Slim. Anyway, Carlos Slim is the richest man, and he's in Mexico. And he was able to save the New York Times from bankruptcy. And when she points out, when that guy saves your company, you dance to his tune. So she says it's worth mentioning that Slim's fortune depends on tens of millions of Mexicans living in the United States, preferably illegally. And so she points out, I think, something very interesting. You can go back to just a few years before he saved the New York Times from bankruptcy. Back in 2004, for example, where the Times magazine, the New York Times newspaper, said that clearly the nation's southern border is under siege. But as you said, that was before Carlos Slim saved the Times from bankruptcy. 10 years later, with a border crisis even worse than it was in 2004, and Latin Americans pouring across the border, she points out that the Times editorial wanted Barack Obama to, quote, go big on immigration and give millions of immigrants permission to stay. And I think it shows a little bit of a difference. If indeed, sometimes people question those skeptics of climate change and wonder whether or not they're getting paid by Exxon or something like that, usually they're not, then I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, well, are the New York Times going to give us the straight story here on the subject of immigration? And she says that one of the ways that Carlos Slim makes his money, and there are many, by the way, richest man in the world, perhaps, he makes money off of illegal immigration, for example, by overcharging Mexicans to call home, especially during World Cup soccer season. He takes a percentage of all cell phone calls into Mexico, and the Telmex interconnection rates are astronomical, she says. International rates are 37% higher in Mexico than the average of all the other countries. But the main way that illegal immigrants benefit Slim is through their remissions. Monopolistic pricing is of little value in a poor country. A monopoly on air in Burundi would not produce the world's richest man. Luckily for Slim, Mexico is located right next to one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And so they estimate that his monopoly costs Mexican consumers $26 billion a year, with more than half of that coming from him gouging his customers. That would have been $20 billion less to spend without 40 million Mexicans living in the United States. Then she goes on to talk about some of the other ways in which he makes money. And, of course, you can begin to see that he benefits tremendously by having Mexicans here. Of course, the Mexican economy does relatively well as well, because what oftentimes happens is that people that do come here to work, oftentimes here illegally, or some try to find a legal means to do so, they will then live basically on subsistence wages and send as much money back to their family in Mexico as they can. And so you can see how that is also something that has benefited the Mexican economy. And just, again, one more illustration of all of that. She even points out that you don't have to just look at the New York Times, because you can find all sorts of other examples of where, in various cases, there has been just an incredible amount of coverage. For example, let's take North Carolina, since we have listeners there. She said the same North Carolina newspapers that gave flood the zone coverage to a rape that never happened at a Duke lacrosse party completely ignore real rapes happening right under their noses being committed against children by immigrants providing cheap labor to the state's farming and meatpacking industries. And you can begin to see that sometimes we're not getting the full story from the mainstream media. And as Marlon Maddox used to say so often, follow the money. When Carlos Slim saved your newspaper from bankruptcy, he pretty much gets you in his pocket, and he can pretty much allow you to dance to his tune. Just before we end, let's also talk about how we are to think about this. You know, certainly the Old Testament tells us that we are to treat aliens with respect. Exodus 22, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Goes on to even talk about what we could do to help those who are in our land. But let's be careful not to take those Old Testament passages and apply them without doing some kind of careful evaluation. Because after all, most of those verses that are cited from Exodus or Deuteronomy or Numbers, certainly those are the passages most often cited, applied first of all just to the nation of Israel, to the theocracy. And in Deuteronomy 31, for example, it required that all foreigners dwelling in Israel must enter into a covenant to obey God, and those who would not support God's leadership were not allowed to enter into the land. Well, we require nothing of the sort when people come into this country as well. And even aliens in Israel were not given the same status and rights as Jews in the land. You can see that in Deuteronomy 1 and in Numbers 15. So we have to be careful when we take some of those Old Testament passages out of context. But on the other hand, I think we also have a very important passage in the New Testament, and that is Romans 13, 1-7. And there it teaches that government is a minister of God for you for good. And if we do what is evil, then we should be afraid. And so we should expect government to actually protect us. And that would be to protect us from foreign invaders. It would be to protect us from those who come and intentionally want to do something to harm us. And that applies obviously to terrorists and to foreign armies. But just ask the family of this 31-year-old who was shot and killed in the San Francisco Pier, whether or not he was a threat, and he was as well. And it seems to me that government should be a minister of God. It should not bear the sword for nothing, but it should protect us. And so we certainly, I think, should require that our government, whether it's a federal government, a state government, or as we've even pointed out here today, a local government that has a sanctuary city, we should demand more of our government than maybe we have been asking for them to do. That's all we have this hour. We're going to move on to some other topics in the second hour, but just before we wind down this topic today and get into some other topics, so let's mention one more time that we have posted some very good articles that you might want to read. An article from Newsmax on outrage over our immigration rules, some concerns being expressed by members of Congress. Another one, the human cost of immigration policy. If you want a few of those facts and figures that I rattled off, some of those can be found in that article or in others, and those are available as they always are on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, also find my Viewpoints commentary today, which is on the death of the death penalty. We've talked about that on this program before. We also have some take action items on the First Amendment Defense Act. And finally, as I mentioned, we encourage those of you that have not helped support Christians in these refugee camps displaced by ISIS to do so. We have been privileged to already send one check to the Cradle Fund, and we'll total up the remaining gifts that come in over the next day or two, and we'll send another check out. And again, if you are unfamiliar with all of that, you might listen to the conversation we had yesterday with Johnny Moore to tell you a little bit more about why we think this is a great and effective way for us to reach out to the least of these. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a biblical view of men and women and their roles in society. All that coming up right after this.
Just over a month ago, we asked you to dig deep and help us send money to the Cradle Fund, emergency help for Christians forced to flee by ISIS, driven from the lands their forefathers have inhabited, sometimes for 2,000 years and more. We asked, you responded. Together, we sent $35,000 to provide things like emergency food, shelter, and relief. And hear this, the money is handed out through local Christians. The people being helped know exactly who is assisting them. It's the body of Christ, people like you in the name of Jesus Christ. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. I was running from ISIS, and you helped me." On behalf of the Cradle Fund and the entire family of Point of View, thank you.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me ask you a question. What does it mean to be a man in this world? For that matter, what does it mean to be a woman in this world? Unfortunately, so often what we find are our ideals and maybe even our conception of what it means, whether we're talking about masculinity or femininity, are really governed in large part by the popular culture. May be influenced by feminism. It may be influenced by various movie roles. Might be influenced by the rise of radical Islam. I mean, all sorts of different conflicting ideas and images are actually put before us. Some of those in the secular culture, but then when we get into the church, we have some as well. And so we're going to try to sort our way through this. So we talk about a new book out called Malestrom, Manhood Swept into the Currents of a Changing World. And I might also point out the author is also the author of the book, which you perhaps have seen in the past, Half the Church, Recapturing God's Global Vision for Women. Joining us by phone is Carolyn Custis James, and she is an adjunct professor at the Biblical Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. Grew up in Portland, Oregon, now lives in Pennsylvania with her husband, and has been very much involved in writing on many of these issues. Perhaps you have seen some of her articles in Leadership Journal. She is also serving as the consulting editor for Zondervan's exegetical commentary series on the New Testament, and joins us now by phone. Author of such books as Lost Women of the Bible, When Life and Beliefs Collide, Half the Church, and Maelstrom. So, Carolyn, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on your program.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about that for a minute. Maybe I'll start with your previous book, because I know some of our listeners are familiar with that since it's been out a little bit longer, Half the Church. Whether we look at men or women, and we'll spend a fair amount of time on men, but I thought I might at least pull that out. Women really struggle in large part with who they are and how they can contribute to God's kingdom, because they're getting all these conflicting voices, first outside the church, from everything from feminism to tradition to, I even talked about radical Islam. Then they're getting conflicting views inside the church about, well, you need to be a working mom, you need to be a stay-at-home mom. It's pretty tough for a woman these days to try to figure out what the Bible really is calling for her to do.
It is. And I, in my own story, I got caught in the middle of all of that. I grew up in the church. My father was a pastor, and I was taught and believed that I was called to be a wife and mother, and expected to be, a stay-at-home mom and, volunteer, maybe teach a Sunday school class in the church. But it didn't matter how much I believed that, how deeply committed I was to that. I couldn't make my story follow that script. And it was a crisis for me, because I felt like I was missing God's calling on my life as a woman. And that began the quest that has resulted in these books, because, I wanted to know, can I miss what God created me to be as a woman? And began asking that question, and just my own struggle with that caused me to look at how other women were struggling. Women who were married and had children, but maybe they lost their children, or maybe they lost their husband, or maybe he lost his job and she had to go to work. And, we live in a real world, and life doesn't play out the way we all dream it will. We've all got bumps in the road, and And I began to see that the questions were bigger than just the ones I was asking for myself. And then when 9/11 happened, I began seeing women on the television screen in burqas. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, I'm not asking questions for them. I'm not thinking of them. And so the questions got bigger because the Bible's global. The Bible isn't an American book. It's a global book. And I was looking for answers that would speak into every woman's life, no matter who she was, no matter where she lived, no matter how young or how old or what season of life or her circumstances, what she sees when she looks in the rearview mirror, any of that. I thought, what is it? Is God's purpose for all of us, or is it only for some of us and only for some seasons of our lives? Or does it encompass all of us all the time? And then the real test for me was when I got ready to write Half the Church. Mm-hmm. A new book had come out that's written by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wood Dunn called Half the Sky. And they had researched what is happening to women and girls globally, some of the atrocities that are going on in the world with sex trafficking and honor killings and child marriages and gendercide. The list just is, it's a very difficult book to read, but I thought, okay, this is the ultimate test for the answers I'm looking for. Is there an answer in God's Word, a purpose, an identity, a meaning for a woman, no matter who she is? And it's quite wonderful to ask big questions of the Bible. And I found answers that were just mind-boggling for me and have totally changed my life and the lives of many women, because God's vision for us is indestructible. And it's sent me to Genesis 1 and 2 to look at the vision that He had for us in the beginning. And that's where He creates His daughters to be His image bearers, to be reflections of who He is, to be invited into a relationship with Him that tells us who we are and why we're here and how we are to live. The creation of the woman in Genesis 2 is not just about marriage, it's about being female. And it's a very strong message that men and women need each other. When God says it's not good for the man to be alone, He's not saying it's not good for him to be alone at home. He needs a wife. It's just a blanket statement. And the word that's used for the woman is the Hebrew word azer, which is the word that's used mostly in the Old Testament for God as the helper of His people. And
yes.
It's rich with what. It's a military word. It's that we are called to battle on behalf of people against the enemy, against the devil and the darkness, and that we're called to join our brothers in doing that. And it encompasses all of life. It encompasses home and family, absolutely, but it also encompasses little girls, that they are created to be reflections of who God is, that they are created to care for others and to do God's work in the world. And same happens for elderly women. I've been with women I was with one woman and she was in her 90s and she had 24 hours left. And she was still thinking about how she could be serving God in the nursing home. There's no end to it.
That's good. Let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue that conversation, because, again, I do want to recommend the other book that we are not going to talk much about today, Half the Church, Capturing God's Global Vision for Women, but we're also going to talk about Malestrom and men right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The death penalty is dying a slow death. Last month, Nebraska became the 19th state in the country to end the practice of capital punishment. The legislature voted to abolish the death penalty and was able to override the veto of the governor. Columnist George Will reminds us that Nebraska is not a nest of liberals. When a conservative state like Nebraska abolishes the death penalty, we should take note. For many years, liberals and progressives have opposed the death penalty because they believe the state should not have the power to execute people, and also rightly point to the number of mistakes that have been made by the courts. Conservatives also point to those mistakes, and they argue that governments are fallible and the death penalty is a government program. The theological basis for capital punishment can be found in the Bible. Genesis 9:6 makes the case by explaining, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Justice and moral proportionality are the principles behind the concept of lex talionis, a life for a life. And though we are no longer under the legal code in the Old Testament theocracy, we can see many crimes listed in the Old Testament that demanded the death penalty. In the New Testament, we see the principle of capital punishment being reinforced by Romans 13:1-7. God ordains government, and the civil magistrate is a minister of God. Paul uses the image of the sword, which also supports the idea of capital punishment. There have been mistakes in the way capital punishment has been administered, but that's not an argument against the death penalty as much as it is an indictment of the criminal justice system. It's also an argument for the careful implementation of the death penalty. When we have clear evidence of a premeditated murder, think of the actions of the Boston Marathon terrorists, then government should be free to move ahead. However, more and more liberals and conservatives have decided to abolish the death penalty in their state. We'll probably see fewer and fewer executions in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with Carolyn Custis James. She is the author of a couple of books, and the one we're talking about now is Malestrom, Manhood Swept into the Currents of a Changing World. And Carolyn, one of the things I love are some of the little charts and graphs that you have there. I love one. It says, does the church have a vision for men that will preach in the Nairobi slums or the streets of Ferguson and to the utterly lost men of ISIS? The same question you were asking about women, you're really in a sense asking about men, because women are getting all sorts of cultural cues from feminists and from Muslims and all that kind of thing. Men are struggling with, am I supposed to be a sensitive man? Am I supposed to be a strong man? Am I supposed to be a warrior? The whole men's movement and then even Promise Keepers, I think, illustrate that men are still trying to find themselves as well from either a cultural or biblical point of view, don't you think?
Yes, it's interesting, and if you look back over history, the definition of what it means to be a man is a moving target, and we're in a time of change today. I mean, I think probably one of at least a major impact on how men see themselves has been the women's movement, and the fact that in modern countries, women are able to pursue education. They are able to choose professions. They become breadwinners, and so it's the ground is moving underneath men, and they are having to rethink, how they fit into this world, and what does it mean to be a man? I mean, it's a really important question, and lots of men are wrestling with that.
And I was just thinking, we mentioned the previous book, Half the Church, and then now, of course, this one, Malestrom. These are not different books. They're really a continuity. And both of them, I think you have to go back to Genesis, because here you have Adam's curse. And really, you say that that's kind of the genesis of this idea of Malestrom. Let's explain what you mean by Malestrom, but also I think let's talk about how we deal with that in terms of some of the scriptures.
Yeah, and it was interesting that as I was working to understand what is God's purpose for me as a woman, what is the Bible's vision for God's daughters, that it was the women who really led me to begin asking the same question for men. Because they're just, there are ways in which the two absolutely always interface. And so yes, it took me back to Genesis 1 and 2. That's where God is vision casting, and that's the only place in the Bible where we have, a pre-fall narrative to look at. Everything that happens after that is in a fallen world, and so it's very important to go back and say, what is God saying about human beings? What is his vision for his world, and how is he revealing himself? And it's very clear in Genesis 1, and we are so familiar with this story that we sort of breeze through it and don't really weigh the things that are being said. But just the opening line, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," is a statement that puts God at the center of everything that follows. That he's our North Star, he's our reference point. And when he creates male and female to be his image bearers, we have to go back and look at him and say, what is he like? How are we to reflect him? And absolutely, it means we need to know him. It's sort of the bottom line of everything that follows, is that by creating us as his image bearers, he's saying the number one thing we need to be concerned about is not what is the definition of male or female, or, how do I function? Am I strong enough, or am I, providing enough? But it's do I know the God who made me?
I know this is kind of jumping ahead, but one of the things I took from your book is we can learn a little bit about what it was intended to be before the fall in Genesis, but I think we can learn a little bit in the life of Jesus. And you point out in the book that Jesus, if indeed we believe in his incarnation, and we do, and most of our listeners probably do as well, then that gives us a very good model. But most of the time when we look at Jesus, we look at his birth, his crucifixion, his resurrection, obviously, because that's the gospel story. But you point out some things that we hardly ever think about. For example, at the age of 12, willing to kind of go cross-culturally, and even countercultural, to disengage from his father and not necessarily be a carpenter, to not marry. There are just some things that I had never really thought about in terms of the, if you will, the life of Jesus. If that can provide us another sort of standard for maleness, I think we can learn some lessons there as well, can't we?
Right, and it was interesting to me too when I came upon that that we take out the Jesus in the middle. We don't focus on that so much, and he's hard to understand, and he does things that make us uncomfortable. But he is the perfect image bearer. I mean, he came to show us what we are to be like, and he gets left out of discussions of what it means to be a man. He's we may talk about pieces of him, but we don't say this is the role model. How did he treat people? Who mattered to him? How did he treat people that everybody else was shunning? It's mind-boggling when we start to do that. But when you look at the Gospels, it's like 75% of the Gospels focus on the life of Jesus, that takes place between his birth and his arrest. And what you're touching on is a major theme in my book, and that is that the whole issue of patriarchy. Because the Bible emerges from a patriarchal culture, we have tended to see that as the Bible's message for how we're to live as male and female. And yet, when you start to look for this in the Bible, you see that the Bible is critiquing that system. That system emerges after the fall, when the rule of God's image bearers that has been turned outward to the world is now turned toward each other. When it says that he shall rule, the man shall rule over the woman. And, the very next thing that happens in the text is that we have Cain killing Abel, because Abel has bested Cain in the presentation of their sacrifices. And so in rage, he kills his brother. And, so violence is introduced into the human experience. But Jesus, when he says that he must be about his Father's business, it's not Joseph's business, it's his Father in heaven. And, in patriarchy, a son is, he carries on his father's name and his father's business, and he builds his father's estate, and sons are the most important. Daughters are going to go build somebody else's family. So, all through the Bible, there's an emphasis on sons, because that's the way that culture was thinking. But, Jesus in so many ways is countering that. And he does it right off the bat when he walks away from Joseph. And when he doesn't marry and he doesn't produce sons for the family to carry on the family name. I mean, it's a major departure from that cultural system. But, when Jesus talks about his kingdom, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He didn't come to endorse any social system that we see, any political system that we see. He came to introduce what was started in the beginning in Genesis 1 and 2, and that we lost in the fall.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. The book is entitled Malestrom. Both of the books that we've mentioned today, Half the Church and Malestrom, both are published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a way in which you can order it if you'd like to do so, and we have a link to the website there as well, the WhitbyForum.com, and you can find out a little bit more about her there. And if you would like to also see a very good question and answer put together on this book, we've posted that on our website, pointofview.net. Just before we go to a break, one last time, we are suggesting that if you have not already given to the Cradle Fund, we send 100% of your gift on to them to help those individuals who have been displaced because of ISIS, fellow Christians, brothers and sisters in refugee camps. This is something we've been doing, and this is kind of the last day we'll probably mention it, and it is available still on our website, pointofview.net. Very excited to see the response that you have given, and yesterday, of course, we spent some time with Johnny Moore talking about that, and if you'd like to know more, of course, you can go back and listen to that podcast as well. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Carolyn Custis James, and we'll take your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Just over a month ago, we asked you to dig deep and help us send money to the Cradle Fund, emergency help for Christians forced to flee by ISIS, driven from the lands their forefathers have inhabited, sometimes for 2,000 years and more. We asked, you responded. Together, we sent $35,000 to provide things like emergency food, shelter, and relief. And hear this, the money is handed out through local Christians. The people being helped know exactly who is assisting them. It's the body of Christ, people like you, in the name of Jesus Christ. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. I was running from ISIS, and you helped me." On behalf of the Cradle Fund and the entire family of Point of View, thank you.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Carolyn Custis James. Again, she has an MA in Biblical Studies as an individual who's an adjunct professor at the Biblical Theological Seminary, also on the board, at least the consulting editor for Zondervan's exegetical commentary series in the New Testament, and an individual who's written quite a bit on these various issues. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. I think this is primarily one of those programs where you sit back and listen, but if we say something you'd like to interact with, feel free to do so. Carolyn, one of the other cards you have here is the full flourishing of God's sons requires and even depends on the full flourishing of his daughters. It works both ways. You know, it does seem to me that, as we were just talking about Jesus a minute ago, Jesus was counterculture in another very significant way, and that is, I would argue, I'll see if you agree, that he elevated the status of women in that patriarchy. And that's very different than the mindset that the world has. A while back, Newsweek magazine had a person writing saying, you know, if you really take the Bible seriously, then various women in Congress right now should not even be serving, because a woman should not have authority over men. And I mean, and again, the guy writing it was obviously trying to make fun of the Bible and wrenching scriptures out of context and everything. But in the culture in which Jesus was in, women had no role, no place. And yet here, first one at the tomb, first one that's an eyewitness, elevated to a status that was unknown in that ancient world. And I always like to share that with some of my skeptical secular people who have a misunderstanding of what the Bible actually teaches. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think Jesus is radical in so many ways. One of the things I think that, and I've said this in Malestrom, that really unleashes the power of the message of the Bible is when we look at the story within the context of its culture, which is what you've just done. You know, to say, you know, in that world, in the world in which when Jesus walked the earth, that women have an important role in terms of in the public sphere. You know, they were it was a man's world, and men were the ones who were the leaders. Men were the ones who were, you know, in the public eye and had a voice, and a woman's voice would be the voice of her father or of her husband or of her sons, but she had no value in and of herself in the public sphere. And yet Jesus is interacting with women in public. He's teaching a woman, as Mary of Bethany, as you know, she sits at his feet as a rabbinical student. You know, talk about that in the Middle East and see how the women are thrilled at what Jesus is doing. It's much more powerful when viewed within the context of that culture, you know, through a patriarchal lens, than it is when we talk about it in our own culture, where women are in universities and are professors, and, you know, it's sort of not very exciting. But it would be earth-shaking, you know, to talk about that, where little girls are having acid thrown in their faces because they're going to school. So, yes, you know, it's the whole Bible has in its powerful moments where women step out onto the pages of Scripture, and God's purposes advance through their actions. And you know, we've just sort of diluted it in how we look at those stories. We've sort of you know, we don't get the full impact of it because we don't understand that culture. You know, that's why, you know, I always say to people when we're talking about the Bible, this isn't an American book. And we are as far away from the culture of the Bible as you can possibly get in today's world. And we need to learn from people who know that world better than we do. It makes the reading of the Bible so much more powerful, and we start to notice things in different ways. You know, like you've just said, you know, for him to be, you know, for the women to be first to the tomb and be the ones who are first to announce the gospel. You know, the first to announce that Jesus is alive. in a day when women were not credible witnesses. It's so countercultural and such a surprise that the biblical authors would record that for us. But it just goes right past us because we don't understand that world.
One of the other ones I thought we might pick up on, and you talk about this in your chapter on the marginalized man, about Matthew, because here's how Jesus treated him as well. It wasn't until I read that I thought, he probably was not only a tax collector on the outside, but he probably collected exorbitant taxes from people like Peter and James and John and others. I had never thought about the fact that this wasn't a guy that's off on the corner that they meet for the first time. This is the guy that's been gouging us, and yet Jesus takes a marginalized man. Of course, you use that to talk about how the apostles marginalized and everything else, so I don't want to just focus, but there's a good example there of how counterculture that was. We just talked about how Jesus was counterculture towards the women. Talk about a rabbi or a Pharisee or somebody having anything to do with an individual who was a tax collector, and then to make him part of his band of brothers, if you will, is pretty counterculture as well, isn't it?
I know. I mean, I said in the book, Matthew needs to sleep with one eye open at least, because they think he was taxing the fishing industry, and that would have been, Peter, James, and John. So yeah, it was. But isn't that the way the gospel works? Is Amazing. That Jesus is bringing together people who, without the gospel, would despise one another, and that's why we are to be this community of people where, when outsiders look at us, they are astonished that we love one another, when we come with this baggage and this history, and when there is the love and forgiveness and acceptance of one another. We have a lot to live up to when you see how Jesus interacts with people, and the point that I'm going after in that chapter is the fact that so many men are marginalized today. I mean, more men are marginalized than rise to the top. And even in our churches, every Sunday, the majority of men in the churches are marginalized because they don't have the right bank account or the right status in the culture, or they are single, or they don't love books, and so we don't say what gift are you bringing to us as a member of the body of Christ. One of the stories that I encountered personally was a man who was a handyman, and in our church he never would have been considered as a potential elder or to teach a Sunday school class or anything like that. But he had extraordinary pastoral gifts, and there were many people in our church who felt deeply loved by this man, and if you didn't show up in church, he would come after you. He'd want to know if you were okay, and that's where I say the message that God has for His sons is bigger than the message that we give them, that you have to be XYZ for us to acknowledge you are really a man, or that you have to be a certain level of success in the community for us to, for you to feel good about yourself. And, I met a man who grew up in Northern Ireland, and he was a young man there when there was all the violence with the IRA, and he said there were no jobs, and he said he felt like he was worthless, and he had two choices. He said, I could either join the IRA and become participate in the violence, and he said if I did that, I would have instant credibility. I would be important in the community. I would be a real man. And he said, or I could immigrate to another country where there were jobs. And it was wonderful to watch him just soaking in the truth that he was created to be God's image bearer.
Yes, very good.
And that means that you can't live an insignificant life, that you can't be a nobody, that you speak and act for God, that that the work that you do is for Him, whether it's, digging ditches or being a handyman or being a medical doctor or being a teacher, or taking care of your family or whatever it is, that there is a cosmic dimension to your life that nobody can take away. And even the men who suffer atrocities, one of the horrors for me in this book is that 30% of the human beings who are trafficked today are men and boys.
Need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Carolyn Custis James. That coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Coming back for a few more minutes with Carolyn Custis James as we talk about the book Malestrom. And again, there's so many things we could cover. Certainly, you have covered a lot in the Old Testament in the book, which we haven't gotten to today, Abraham and Judah and Boaz. But I thought since we were in the New Testament, we might certainly spend a little bit of time talking about the Apostle Paul, because you talk about how, in some respects, he was a liberating figure because he crossed some of these lines, the racial lines, the gender, sexual lines, and things of that nature. And I think we can learn some lessons as well, and that might even provide a model for what that might look like in the future, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, he is a remarkable figure, especially in today's world, to think about the fact that the Apostle Paul was a religious terrorist, and that he was responsible for the deaths of a lot of people in his day, and was on his way to Syria to expand his pursuit of Christians. I mean, one of his big concerns was just the purity of the Jewish faith, and this was a corruption of it in his mind, and the inclusion of Gentiles was, something he was outraged about. If you heard that Saul of Tarsus was headed your way, which was the name he was known by, you would want to get out of there. And Christians were terrified of him. And yet, and this is so encouraging to think about in our day and age, the gospel can reach behind enemy lines, and it is doing that today in our world, but it did it in Paul's day, and Jesus went after him, and the transformation in his life is unbelievable, because he ended up being the apostle to the Gentiles. It was just, it's so ironic that the one who was setting out to destroy that ends up being the one who is the champion of it, and is spreading the gospel all through, all through even Europe, but Asia Minor, and it so goes against the grain of his heart prior to his encounter with Jesus. And this is where you begin to see all these transformations, where he is loving Gentiles, where he is depending on them, where the letters that he writes to them, where he pours out his heart and just can't wait to get back and be with them again. It's a total change. This isn't he isn't putting up with them. He is bonded to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then with respect to women, one of the wildest stories in his story is when he is on his missionary journey, has his itinerary all scoped out, and is blocked by the Spirit and given a vision where he's called to go to Macedonia, which is it's Europe. He's being called to Europe. And when he gets there, you can imagine his expectations of, what kind of crowds are going to be waiting. And when he arrives in Philippi, all he can find is a group of praying Gentile women. And he plants the first church in Europe with a team of women. Mm-hmm. And the letter to the Philippian church, he talks about thanking God for their fellowship with him in the gospel from the first day. Well, the first day, it was all women. And, in Romans 16, the ending of the epistle to the Romans, it's filled with female names of women he admires and who is grateful for their participation with him in the ministry. It is so against the grain of his culture, and, such an upside down change in him, but that's what the gospel does. And then you have the story of Onesimus, who was a runaway slave that Paul met when he was in prison, and he sends him back to his master Philemon, and we have that letter in our Bibles. And he calls him a brother, and says he is my heart. So you have Paul, the scripture where he says that there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave or free. It's a description of Paul. It's a description of the change that the gospel made in him. Sometimes, I think we so underestimate the power of the gospel. Yes. and how radically it is supposed to change us. It's not just supposed to tidy us up, or make us, a kinder, gentler version of everything else. It's supposed to make us different, make us totally different from the way the rest of the world lives, so that they want to come. One of the things that upset me when I was researching what's happening to men in the world is reading that young men are being drawn to ISIS,
yeah,
from the West, and what scholars are seeing is that they are looking for identity, meaning, and purpose, like my friend from Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think, why aren't we in that conversation? Why aren't we giving them a big enough vision for what God calls them to be and do, that they are swarming to us?
Yes, they can find their meaning and identity, certainly in that case. We're just about out of time, and again, Galatians 3:28, for there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, there is neither male and female, for you are one and all in Christ Jesus. So again, just a great kind of summary verse. If people want to contact you, we have a link to some of the blog posts that you have posted. Is that a good way that if people want to know more about what you are doing, they can follow you?
Yes, they can. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter too. So, yes.
Well, we do have those links on our website, and again, I would encourage people, as a matter of fact, if they click on your picture there's a Twitter link, a Facebook link, and then a link to the website, WhitbyForum.com, and that's where they can find out a lot more about some of the other books. Half the Church, Recapturing God's Global Vision for Women, and then also Malestrom, Manhood Swept into the Currents of a Changing World. So, Carolyn Custis James, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for the honor of being your guest.
Well, again, we're just about out of time, so let me encourage those of you that are looking for more information. We have posted it today on our website. We spent some time, obviously, in the first half of the program today talking about immigration, and if you wanted some of those facts and figures, they are still there. We have the question to answer that we've posted so that you would have some more information about this book, and in case you would like to know more before you order the book, you can do so. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, and most importantly, of course, you can order it online if you would like to do so. As you go to the website, let me just mention that many times we talk about issues, and you might want to go and listen to them again, pass them on to others. We do have an opportunity for you to either watch it or to listen to it. We have a YouTube channel. Of course, we have podcasts. We have all sorts of resources, and we encourage you from time to time to share some of this information with others. And so we have a share button and made it really easy for you to work with that as well. So all of it available at our website, pointofview.net. And one last time, as I have mentioned before, we do want to encourage any of you that still wanted to give to the Cradle Fund to do so. We're going to send over our last check and move on, but this is just something we have been very excited about, an opportunity to minister, certainly indirectly, but still to minister to those who have been so tragically impacted by ISIS. And so we, again, have that link on our website, and we encourage you to find that there as well. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about everything from the Big Bang to all sorts of issues in the news. Once again, I think you're going to appreciate some of the conversation we're going to have, so join us then. I want to thank Abby and Catherine and Chris and Andrew for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Just over a month ago, we asked you to dig deep and help us send money to the Cradle Fund, emergency help for Christians forced to flee by ISIS, driven from the lands their forefathers have inhabited, sometimes for 2,000 years and more. We asked, you responded. Together, we sent $35,000 to provide things like emergency food, shelter, and relief. And hear this, the money is handed out through local Christians. The people being helped know exactly who is assisting them. It's the body of Christ, people like you, in the name of Jesus Christ. In Matthew 25, Jesus said, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty. You gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. I was running from ISIS, and you helped me." On behalf of the Cradle Fund and the entire family of Point of View, thank you. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.